You're listening to another episode of Detective Diaries, brought to you by Private Detective Answers Investigation. This series explores often offbeat conversations and diverse topics with some of the real people involved in the investigation.
In part one of our two-part episode on the life of Frederick Abberline, the famous Victorian detective, we looked at his early life and his part in the infamous Whitechapel murders. The name Frederick George Abberline has become synonymous with that of Jack the Ripper, and he has been portrayed as everything from an alcoholic, a drug addict, a womanizer, and a bully. In reality, Abberline was none of these, but instead was a devoted husband and a dedicated policeman in a time of rampant corruption. Furthermore, the Whitechapel murders were not the only notorious cases he worked on. From his humble origins as a clockmaker through to his rising through the ranks of the Metropolitan Police, I have told the story of a man who led some of the most infamous investigations in British criminal history. Long before the Ripper, Abberline infiltrated an Irish terrorist group known as the Fenians before he came embroiled in the Cleveland Street scandal, an incident that almost brought the government to its knees. When he retired from the police at the age of 49, Abberline had received 84 commendations and awards, a testimony to his tenacity and his ability. If you've not listened to part one, you'll see a link in the show notes to this episode. In the meantime, we will transport you back to 1889 and the cases of the Cleveland Street scandal and the Turkish bond robbery. In July 1889, Police Constable Luke Hanks was investigating a theft from the London Central Telegraph Office. During the investigation, a 15-year-old telegraph boy named Charles Thomas Swinscoe was discovered to be in possession of 14 shillings, equivalent to several weeks of his wages. At the time, messenger boys were not permitted to carry any personal cash in the course of their duties, to prevent their own money being mixed with that of the customers. Suspecting the boy's involvement in the theft, Constable Hanks brought him in for questioning. After hesitating, Swinscoe admitted that he earned the money by working as a prostitute for a man named Charles Hammond, who operated a male brothel at 19 Cleveland Street. According to Swinscoe, he was introduced to Hammond by a General Post Office clerk, 18-year-old Henry Newlove. In addition, he named two 17-year-old telegraph boys who also worked for Hammond, George Almer Wright and Charles Ernest Thickbroom. Constable Hanks obtained corroborating statements from Wright and from Thickbroom and, armed with these, a confession from Newlove. Constable Hanks reported the matter to his superiors, and the case was given to Detective Inspector Frederick Abberline. Inspector Abberline went to the brothel on the 6th of July with a warrant to arrest Hammond and Newlove for violation of Section 11 of the Criminal Law Amendment Act 1885. The Act made all homosexual acts between men, as well as procurement or attempted procurement of such acts, punishable by up to 2 years' imprisonment, with or without hard labour. He found the house locked and Hammond gone, but Abberline was able to apprehend Newlove at his mother's house in Camden Town. In the time between his statement to Hanks and his arrest, Newlove had gone to Cleveland Street and warned Hammond, who had consequently escaped to his brother's house in Gravesend. And this is where the intrigue started. On the way to the police station, Newlove named Lord Arthur Somerset and Henry Fitzroy, Earl of Euston, as well as a British Army colonel by the name of Jervois, as visitors to Cleveland Street. Somerset was the head of the Prince of Wales stables. While not implicated, aside from the connection to Lord Arthur Somerset, Albert Edward, the the Prince of Wales and future Edward VII, the second child and eldest son of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, Edward, nicknamed Bertie, was Prince of Wales and heir apparent to the British throne for almost 60 years. During his mother's long reign, he was largely excluded from political influence and came to personify the leisured elite. When the press caught hold of the scandal, his name became mentioned by implication. Although Lord Somerset was interviewed by Inspector Abberline, no immediate action was taken against him, and the authorities were slow to act on the allegations of Somerset's involvement. Abberline placed a watch on the now empty house, and details of the case shuffled between government departments. An arrest warrant was issued on the 19th of August in the name of George Beck, who was an acquaintance of Hammond's who pretended to be a clergyman. Beck had actually worked at the telegraph office but had been sacked for improper conduct with the messenger boys. A 17-year-old youth found in Beck's London lodgings revealed to the police that Beck had gone to Portsmouth and was returning shortly by train. The police arrested Beck at London Waterloo railway station. In his pockets, they discovered letters from Algernon allies. Abberline sent Constable Hanks to interview allies at his parents' home in Sudbury in Suffolk. Allies admitted to receiving money from Somerset, having a sexual relationship with him, and working at Cleveland Street for Hammond. On the 22nd of August, police interviewed Somerset for a second time, after which Somerset left and fled to Bad Homburg, where the Prince of Wales was taking his summer holiday. Because the press initially barely covered the story, the affair would have faded quickly from public memory if it was not for journalist Edward Park. He was the editor of the obscure politically radical weekly called the North London Press. Park had got wind of the affair when one of his reporters had brought him the story of New Love's conviction. Park had begun to question why the prostitutes had been given such light sentences relative to their offence. The usual penalty for gross indecency was 2 years' imprisonment, and how Hammond had been able to evade arrest. His curiosity aroused, Park found out that the boys had named prominent aristocrats, and he subsequently ran a story on the 28th of September hinting at their involvement, but without detailing specific names. A fortnight later, on the 16th of November, Park published a follow-up story which specifically named Henry James Fitzroy, the Earl of Euston, in an indescribably loathsome scandal in Cleveland Street. Parks further alleged that Euston may have gone to Peru and they had been allowed to escape to cover up the involvement of a more highly placed person, that person not being named, but who was believed by many to be Prince Albert Victor, the son of the Prince of Wales. Newspaper coverage of the day reinforced negative attitudes about male homosexuality as an aristocratic vice, presenting the telegraph boys as corrupted and exploited by members of the upper class. That attitude reached its climax a few years later when Oscar Wilde was tried for gross indecency as a result of his affair with Lord Alfred Douglas. Some conjecture that Wilde may well have alluded to the Cleveland Street scandal in The Picture of Dorian Gray, which was first published in 1890. The news of the denouncement of these notable characters spread like wildfire up the police hierarchy. Soon, many members of the British government were involved. Both the Attorney General and the Director of Public Prosecutions believed that Lord Somerset should be tried and punished severely. But many cabinet members disagreed, so a prosecution was blocked for a long while. The issue ended up at the table of the Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury. After long deliberation among the cabinet, the demand for justice and a swift end to the investigation outdid the desire to avoid an aristocratic scandal, and the order to issue a warrant for Somerset was given. However, the time it took for the cabinet to decide on what action to take meant that Lord Somerset was able to slip off abroad by the time the warrant was issued for his arrest. Lord Arthur Somerset first fled to France and then travelled to Constantinople, Budapest, Vienna, and back to France, where he lived in comfortable exile in the south until his death in 1926. He had initially gone to Bad Homburg, but departed after being tipped off that arrest warrants were imminent. On the 12th of November, a warrant for Somerset's arrest was finally issued. By this time, Somerset was safely abroad, and the warrant caught little public attention. After an unsuccessful search for employment in Turkey and in Austria-Hungary, Somerset lived the rest of his life in self-imposed and comfortable exile in the south of France. The mismanagement of justice that allowed Somerset to escape was met with outrage by many, most notably the radical Liberal MP Henry Labouchere, who had first introduced the draconian Criminal Amendment Act of 1885. In his newspaper, Truth, Labouchere launched a cavalcade of attacks that condemned the government for its slothfulness in prosecuting the high-ranking perpetrators. He also denounced the government in various speeches in the House of Commons, asking, "Why are the minnows to be imprisoned and the sharks to be allowed to go scot-free?" emphasising that the high-class noblemen were given legal immunity over men of lower estate. Even before Henry Labouchere made the case a nationwide political and social scandal, the North London Press, which was little known at the time, and its editor, Ernest Park, utilised the scandal to push their radical agenda and to attack Lord Salisbury's government, who they despised. Park was, in fact, the first editor to discuss the story, having learnt about it from one of his reporters who wondered why the persons involved in the case all seemed to be getting off lightly, while other newspapers had hushed it down. If it was not for the efforts of Park himself, it is likely that the story would never have exploded, and it was likely that Labouchere would not have engaged with it. The main talking point of Park and his North London press was the guilt of Lord Euston, who had been mentioned by Newlove as a high-ranking patron of the brothel. In keeping with the tradition of the time, Lord Euston brought a libel case against Park's allegations and brought with it a truly fascinating defence. It was that he had actually entered the Cleveland Street establishment thinking that he would be seeing naked actresses, and therefore he was not committing gross indecency. Despite this genius defence, it was only the inconsistent accounts of Park's witnesses that won the case for Euston, who nonetheless would be chased by rumours for the rest of his life. On the 15th of January, the Times of London reported,
"The libel action brought by Lord Euston against Mr. Park, editor of the North London Press, for having in an issue of his paper stated that Lord Euston was implicated in the Cleveland Street scandal and had fled the country, was commenced at the Old Bailey Police Court today, when Mr. Park surrendered himself and pleaded not guilty and justification. Sir Charles Russell, QC, counsel for the Earl of Euston, opened the case."
At the trial, Euston admitted that when walking along Piccadilly, a tout had given him a card which read, "Pause Plastique, C. Hammond, 19 Cleveland Street." Euston testified that he went to the house believing Pause Plastique meant a display of female nudes. He paid a sovereign to get in, but upon entering, Euston said he was appalled to discover the improper nature of the place and immediately left. The defence witnesses contradicted each other and could not describe Euston accurately. The Evening News said,
"In the libel action, the Earl of Euston versus the editor of the North London Press, which was resumed today at the Old Bailey, Mr. Lockwood, QC, counsel for the defendant, Mr. Park, called 4 witnesses, all of whom deposed that Lord Euston had visited the club in Cleveland Street several times. The plaintiff, however, in cross-examination, repeated the statement he made in the police court that he visited the place once only. The case stands adjourned."
The final defence witness, John Saul, was a male prostitute who had early been involved in a homosexual scandal at Dublin Castle and who had featured in a clandestinely published erotic novel The Sins of the Cities of the Plain, which was cast as his autobiography. Delivering his testimony in a manner described as brazen effrontery, Saul admitted to earning his living by leading an immoral life and practicing criminality, and detailed his alleged sexual encounters with Euston at the house. The defence did not call either Newlove or Veck as witnesses and could not produce any evidence that Euston had left the country. The case did not go well for the defendant, Ernest Park, as reported in the Times the next day.
In the course of the Euston Park case at the Old Bailey today, the evidence of one of the witnesses, named Saul, who testified that Lord Euston had committed horrible acts at the Cleveland Street Club, was severely shaken in cross-examination by Sir Charles Russell as to the identity of the man whom the witness assumed to be Lord Euston. The counsel for the plaintiff further elicited the fact that Saul's character was of the most abominable kind. The Earl of Euston, while under examination, swore that he was hitherto ignorant of Saul's existence.
On the 16th of January 1890, the jury found Park guilty. The trial was concluded with a victory for Lord Euston. Under the law of the day, Park's fate was dire.
The Euston Park libel action was concluded today and resulted in Mr. Park being found guilty and sentenced to 1 year's imprisonment.
We have followed Frederick Abberline from his early days as a clockmaker in Dorset to his career as a dynamic police officer in London, and his notoriety from being involved with Jack the Ripper. The real truth is that his famous cases are just a small part of his career. While Abberline finished his police career frustrated at being hampered by higher powers in his probing of the Cleveland Street affair, it was not to be his last big case. The sound of cross-channel steamships and Victorian railway stations conjures up images of my favourite Abberline case, that of the Turkish bond robbery. Frederick Abberline was the primary officer in charge of investigating the Turkish bond robbery, which involved the theft and the fraudulent trading of Ottoman Empire government bonds in the early 1890s. The Ottoman Empire issued government bonds in the 19th century primarily to finance military modernisation and infrastructure projects, and to cover large and persistent budget deficits. The first foreign loan, which marked the beginning of this practice, was specifically taken out to meet the expenses of the Crimean War in 1854. The Ottoman government consistently spent more than it generated in revenue due to an inefficient tax collection system and lavish spending by the imperial court. Bonds and foreign loans were used to cover these chronic deficits and repay existing high-interest domestic loans from local Galata bankers. A major portion of the borrowed funds was intended to restructure and modernise the Ottoman army and the navy, and to better defend the empire against internal rebellions and external threats from major powers like Russia. The robbery involved bonds issued by the Ottoman Empire, which was subsequently stolen and illegally circulated. The investigation began when information surfaced in November 1891 regarding the presentation of some of these stolen coupons at the Imperial Ottoman Bank and the Union Bank in London. The matter was placed in the hands of our man, Inspector Abberline, who then led the inquiries that resulted in a prosecution. On the 12th of January 1890, a parcel of Turkish priority bonds and a small quantity of Mexican bonds were insured in Paris for £8,400, around £250,000 today, with the Marine Insurance Company and dispatched to a firm of brokers in London. They duly left by train on the 11th of January and were placed on board the South Eastern Company steamer Mary Beatrice at Boulogne by the officials of the railway company. When, however, the safe where they should have been placed was examined, on arrival of the boat on the English shore, two of the parcels, namely those worth £8,400, were missing. From inquiries at Boulogne, it was found that sundry persons had been seen to leave the steamer in a hurry. Chief Inspector Abberline was sent over to Boulogne to see if he could recognise among the arriving passengers any persons unknown to him as reputed bond robbers. On the 8th of April, he caused to be arrested by the French police 4 men whom he saw leaving the Channel steamer Breeze. One of them, a man named Powell, who had been suspected for years as a bond robber, was found at the police office to be vigorously eating something. A big French officer, seeing this, seized him by the jaw and, forcing his mouth open, took out of his mouth a mass of somewhat pulpy paper, which, when it had been carefully handled, turned out to be a significant clue, a cloakroom ticket for an article left at Victoria Station in London. In Powell's hand, another ticket was found, which related to a valise left at Dover. This valise was found to contain sham bonds, which it was supposed it was intended to replace any genuine ones that might be stolen on the voyage. 2 keys were found on another man, one of which was a master key that could open a large number of locks of different patterns and which fitted the locks of all the safes of the steamers on the fleet. Another of the men was noticed to be searching for an insect under his armpit. On his arm being removed from his coat and his coat taken off, a crushed wax impression of one of the keys of the steamer Breeze was found. The 4th man was found to be in possession of impressions of 2 other keys. Efforts were made to bring about the extradition of these men for larceny on a British vessel, but unsuccessfully, the French police contenting themselves with examining them and, after detaining them for 5 months, turning them out of the country. The ticket of an article left at Victoria Station had in the meantime been found to refer to a hat box containing 62 of the coupons belonging to a part of the parcel of bonds stolen. The wily Inspector Abberline thought it advisable to make inquiries at London's Cannon Street station. On searching at Cannon Street, he found a Gladstone bag which had been lying in a cloakroom from about the time of the robbery. Being able to open the bag without breaking the lock, he examined it and inside discovered a large number of the missing bonds. He then arranged with the railway police to be communicated with when anybody called for the bag. A woman called a few days later and was told to come again. However, instead of returning, she telegraphed to ask them to send the bag to the Piccadilly office of the company. While awaiting the bag's arrival at the office, Inspector Abberline went into the Café Monaco and there saw the woman in conversation with the man Powell and Koch, who Abberline had suspected as a bond robber. Koch gave the woman something and she went into the office and on its arrival received the bag and drove with Koch to the St John's Wood Road railway station and left it there. They then went into a house in Carlton Road in St John's Wood, where it was discovered by Inspector Abberline that they were cohabiting. Inspector Abberline went in and interviewed them, and when the bag was sent for, they were surprised to find it empty. Abberline's colleague had removed the bonds safely. For Koch and his mistress, the game was up. Subsequently, £2,000 worth of bonds were seized by the Vienna police in the possession of 2 men who were sentenced to terms of imprisonment in consequence. These recovered bonds, with those found at Peach's house, left only a few unaccounted for. You will recall the suspects who were held in France by the French authorities. To Abberline's disgust, France released them after 5 months, expelling them from the country. However, the chagrined Abberline did not lose heart. He charged a financial agent named Frederick Peach not with stealing bonds, but with obtaining a loan of £890, equivalent to around £150,000 today, on a parcel of bonds, well knowing them to be stolen property and that they had been stopped by the Ottoman government. Frederick Peach was a member of the Primrose Club. It was from there that he corresponded with a Mr. Sears, whom he knew from previous dealings and to whom he owed £160, stating that a friend of his, Mr. Archibald Melville, who was about to be married, wanted an advance of £1,000 upon the security of 20 £100 Turkish bonds. After negotiations with Peach, and also with a nominal borrower, Archibald Melville, the money was paid over to Peach, who handed to Mr. Sears the 20 bonds with attached coupons. These were placed at the bank. The notes paid to Peach included 7 of £100 each. Most of these were afterwards found to have been changed by Peach himself. The fact that the bonds were stolen was ultimately discovered through the presentation of one of the coupons for payment at the Ottoman Bank. Then information was given to the Marine Insurance Company, who had been the losers by the original robbery, and they called in the suave Abberline, who went very artfully to work. He found that Peach and the so-called Archibald Melville had occupied a house together at Eastbourne, that Melville was not at the time about to be married, as he was already a married man with a family, and occupied a house in Richmond, close by to Peach. One of the notes was traced to Brighton, where Abberline found it had been cashed by Archibald Melville. In Brighton, he was told by the bank that they knew Melville to be respectable, as he was introduced to them by the wealthy Mr. Koch. Koch, of course, was already known to Abberline in connection with another phase of the bond robbery. Peach was arrested, but Melville somehow was missed. At Peach's house in Richmond, £2,300 of the stolen bonds were found in a cavity under the floor beneath a bed, together with a quantity of correspondence with Melville, which threw light on this and other transactions. At his trial, Peach contended that he was simply the agent for Melville and had no knowledge that the bonds had been stolen. Mr. Justice Hannay remanded the prisoners, offering to accept bail in 2 sureties of £200 each. Of the 2 major cases that we talked about, the Cleveland Street scandal rocked England. There are some suggestions that Abberline may have voiced misgivings about the way the cover-up was handled, and this may have upset his superiors. Whatever the truth of the matter, the Cleveland Street scandal was the last significant case that Abberline investigated for the Met. Following his promotion to Chief Inspector the following year, he was reassigned to desk duties back at Scotland Yard and retired on a full pension in 1892 after 29 years' service. He was just 49 years old. Rather than relax into his retirement, Abberline was soon employed again by the famous Pinkerton Detective Agency, who had recently opened a branch in Europe. He worked with the Pinkertons for 12 years, during which time he earned a considerable reputation for cleaning up the gambling casinos of Monaco. He retired again for the final time in 1904 at the age of 61 and moved to the seaside town of Bournemouth with his wife Emma. We can see his house at 195 Holdenhurst Road from where I stand on the opposite side of the road in the early evening by a pedestrian crossing. Abberline is today commemorated by a blue plaque on the house in Bournemouth where he spent his final years. This was unveiled in 2001 by the Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. There's a picture in our show notes. Even in the early evening, the road is now busy, probably a dramatic change to 1904. The words on the blue plaque read, Escort, 195 Holdenhurst Road, the final home of Inspector Frederick George Abberline, 1843 to 1929. During his 29 years with the Metropolitan Police, Abberline gained 84 commendations and awards and became well known for his work on the case of Jack the Ripper. Frederick remained in Bournemouth, living with his wife Emma until he passed away in 1929, Emma following just 3 months later. The entrance to Wimborne Road Cemetery, where Frederick and Emma lie, is on a busy junction. You can hear the hum of traffic behind me. It is an impressive and beautiful place, with a Victorian Gothic chapel designed by Christopher Creek and built of local Purbeck stone. Not having a cemetery map, I found Frederick's grave from a photograph, identifying the location from the houses in the background. For anyone who isn't previously aware, the headstone is a surprise. For a grave that is 100 years old, it is surprisingly pristine, made of black marble, and there is another story behind this. In 2007, a group of police officers campaigned for a headstone to be erected. A local stonemason donated the headstone. We tried to contact Matt Williams, the stonemason who so generously gave of his time and skills, but were unable to do so. If you ever are listening, Mr. Williams, we would love to talk to you. On the back of the headstone lies the credit. Memorial supplied by Williams Monumental Company, Friends of the Metropolitan Police Museum, and Pinkerton's Detective Agency. As I look at the front of the headstone, I can read the epitaph to one of the most influential detectives of the 19th century. In memory of Frederick George Abberline, born 8th of January 1843, Blandford Forum, died 10th of December 1929, Bournemouth. Chief Inspector CID Scotland Yard and his wife, Emma Abberline, née Bearmont, 26 September 1844 to the 15th of March 1930. Frederick George Abberline, rest in peace.
Part 1 of our feature on the detective Frederick Abberline is already available on Detective Diaries. You may also like to listen to our episode on the Italian detective Giuseppe Dossi. They called him the artist detective, a man who didn't just solve crimes, he performed them into the light. Step back into the shadows of 1920s Italy, a world of rising dictators, political theater, and one man with 17 different faces. To a poet, he was a limping Czech veteran. To a criminal, he was a German doctor or a simple priest. Dossi was a master of fregolismo detectivistico, the art of the total transformation. But behind the wigs and the fake accents was a man of absolute dangerous integrity. When the fascist regime needed a scapegoat for Rome's most horrific crimes, they found one. But Dossi refused to look away. He chose the truth over his own safety, defying his superiors to hunt the real monster of Rome, a quest that would cost him his career, his freedom, and his sanity. Join us for a journey through the disguises and the heart of Giuseppe Dossi. This is Detective Diaries, brought to you by Answers Investigation. Listen now on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you find your truth, or in the language of Giuseppe Dossi. Unitevi a noi per un viaggio attraverso i travestimenti e il cuore di Giuseppe Dossi. Questo è Detective Diaries, offerto da Answers Investigation. Ascoltatelo ora su Spotify, Apple Podcast o ovunque troviate la vostra verità.
Get involved. Detective Diaries is interactive, which involves you, the listener. Do you have a case you would like discussed? A burning question about investigative life? Send an email to podcast@private-detectives.co.uk or reach out via social media. You may hear your story featured in an upcoming episode. Don't forget to leave your contact details. The email address is in the show notes.
We hope you enjoyed today's podcast, brought to you by Answers Investigation and UK Fingerprint. If you've enjoyed our conversation and want to learn more about the fascinating world of investigations, be sure to check out Private Detectives Answers Investigation. Their experienced team offers a wide range of discreet and professional services, helping you find the answers you need with integrity and expertise. If you're interested in fingerprint analysis or require specialist fingerprint services, don't miss UK Fingerprint. As one of the leading fingerprint companies in the UK, they provide everything from identification to background checks, working with individuals, businesses, financial institutions, and gambling companies. To find out more, visit www.private-detectives.co.uk, that's a minus sign, and www.ukfingerprint.co.uk. These are your go-to resources for investigative solutions and fingerprint expertise. You can call their office on 020 7158 0332. Thanks once again for tuning in, Until next time, stay curious and keep seeking the truth.